right. Let's start the show. So you've got all the pieces of your story. You think it's a banger. You're just not quite sure what stays and what goes. And maybe not even what order they go in. Well, have no fear, my friends. That's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's live episode. What's up, storytellers? Welcome back to the Storytelling Lab. This is episode 156. And today we're going to talk about the most important sentence of your story. Or if you're a filmmaker like me, the most important scene of your story. And we're going to look at this from a unique perspective of the world of storyboarding. If you aren't familiar with storyboarding, that's the art of framing out the structure, the skeleton, the foundation of your story through sketches, through images that just show the shots that you're going to use. When you're able to do that, you're able to visually see the whole story from a top-down approach and start to see how it would flow as a film, as a moving picture, right? So it's very effective at understanding like what's necessary, what's not necessary, and trimming the fat so that you can progress your story along, right? That's always the goal, whether you're telling 6-second stories or 60-minute stories. The goal is always to move the story forward. So today we're uniquely going to look at the work of Nick Sung. Now, I had Nick Sung on the podcast years ago, back in episode 2, I think, long time ago. We're in season, not episode 2, season 2 rather, still years ago. We're in season 11 now. We're 156 episodes in. So maybe he was episode, I don't know, 10, 20, something like that. Nick Sung is a storyboard artist from Pixar, or he was at that time. And he did this amazing project with Pixar and Airbnb, two of the biggest brands at that time. They did this great collaboration called Project Snow White. Now, that project, Snow White, was the first feature-length cartoon. Walt Disney did this storyboarding technique to start to see the story. This is where this all came from. And this collaboration between Pixar and Airbnb was a very interesting way to look at how to use this technique that they did in Snow White to storyboard out the user experiences for Airbnb, which has two user groups, guest and host. And it was really effective because as they started to storyboard out the potential user stories, what did they start to see? They started to see the potential problems or obstacles that they would have to overcome, which allowed them to start thinking about the potential solutions to those potential problems, therefore cutting off those problems and solving them before they ever were created, before they ever manifested, before they ever happened, which made everything very efficient and very effective in terms of carving out that user journey. Now, in this conversation with Nick, it wasn't just about Project Snow White, which takes some time. Look up the YouTube video, learn about that project when you're doing your brand storytelling, because storytelling is not just outward marketing, external storytelling. It's also the story that you're going to tell your team so that we all get behind the same narrative and the same mission and the same purpose. And when you do that, you use this process called story design, which is similar to design thinking of playing out the journeys of your users in a way that informs you so that you can make that experience and that journey as positive and pleasant and transformative as possible. Now let's go back to your external stories. Let's see how we can use this same technique of storyboarding, while not exactly storyboarding, but using what Nick taught me as a way to choose what stays and what goes in your stories. Whether it's email newsletters, whether it's your LinkedIn post or your social media post or your TikTok videos, whatever. It doesn't have to be visually created in order to leverage this technique. So I asked Nick, how do you choose when you don't have a lot of time or you don't have a lot of money, therefore not a lot of opportunity for setups and changing the shot? How do you decide what stays and what goes? If you know, how do you make this decision when you're storyboarding out of what shot to use? And he had this great perspective which directly applies to this. What he said was, what I think about is what's the most important shot to convey the scene that's happening, what's happening in the scene. So the way I think about it, he says, is if I could only use one shot to tell the story, the entire story or that entire scene, what would that shot be? Now, in filmmaking, that might be your wide shot, which captures all the detail and the context of the shot. It probably wouldn't be a close-up on somebody's eye, right? Which you would use to show the finer detail, like the tear welling up in their eye. If you only showed that without the context going on in the bigger scene, that wouldn't communicate what we want it to. So what's that master shot that you would use? That's what we call it in filmmaking. Is like, here's the master shot, the main shot, where if we have nothing else, we could still do the scene. Everything else is just coverage. And then you build from there. Okay, so let's say I'm gifted 2 shots. What would be the second shot that I choose? Now you start to see how it goes on. Okay, and third and fourth and so forth. So the way to think about this when you're thinking about crafting the script of your story or your LinkedIn post, your email newsletter, or your TikTok video, any story that you're telling, think about it in the same way. The first thing that this does is help you understand what is essential, what's the most important piece or pieces of content that you need to include. I had a friend once tell me, I was talking with her about a potential conflict that was coming up with someone close to me. And when conflict arose between us, it often got heated, and therefore the actual point of the communication there would be a breakdown, there would be fallout, and it wouldn't get through and nothing would get resolved. If you've ever been in that situation, it's a very frustrating situation to be in, especially if you're a person like me who likes resolution and likes closure. So I was talking with this friend about how to approach it, knowing that it may blow up in my face and nothing may ever come across, because I really needed to get something off my chest. And this person said very wisely, well, make the first thing that you say the main point that you have to get across, because if after that it blows up, you've at least said the thing. So instead of starting, this is a perfect example for your stories, instead of starting with this preamble of like, well, this has been going on and sometimes you make me feel this way and blah, 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 which any of those things might set that person off, you just say, I'm not happy with the way you acted at Lizzie's birthday party. I'm making that up, obviously. Sorry, Lizzie. Similarly, in your story, I'm not saying you have to come out with the first sentence immediately like that, but I want you to think about what would stay and what's most important, because that's what all the rest of the story, or the shots if you're storyboarding, leverage on. That's what they rest on. That is the main thing that's propping the story up. And sometimes, yes, it may be the first thing that you say, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. But you have to identify what's the most important piece that I need, and everything else is working with it to make it more of a whole story, more of a whole experience. That's just coverage. So when you think about this storytelling exercise, storyboarding exercise rather, you think about what's the single most important piece of content that you need to include. And that's where you start in terms of building the story. Okay? Then you start to think of like, okay, well, what's the second most crucial element? And when you think about the second choice, you think about, oh, okay, what would go nicely with this? What would work well with this main sentence or this main part of my story or this main shot in the storyboard? And the way to think about that is, what would give it a little bit of juxtaposition, right? What would really add to it and fill in the gaps? We can look at this like lighting. When you light someone's face, for example, in lighting, you have what's called a key light. That's your main light. If you have no other light, you have to have the key light, because that creates shadows on their face, which shows that they're three-dimensional and not washed out or flat. And it shows that they're a real person. But it does, if it's harsh, it creates a lot of shadow on the opposite side of that person's face from the light. So if it goes across my nose, I could have a big shadow of my nose coming across here. So what do you have? You have a secondary light called the fill light, which is less harsh. It's softer, sometimes further away. And it fills in that shadow, not completely, because you want to see the shadow, but it fills it in just a little bit, 50% or so that now it's not this stark, dark line coming across. That's what you want to think about when you think about building the story around that main essential sentence or piece of content or shot. Okay? How can we build around it and make it more intriguing? Then you start to think of like how you can twist with it and play with it and arrange the content to maximize the impact. All stories are up and down, ebbs and flows, right? You increase the tension and you release the tension. Right? You open the loops, you close the loops. You all have probably heard this before if you listen to the show. So your shots or your sentences should also do that. You break up the monotony. It's like a roller coaster ride. If you have a story that's just going laterally across, or if we want to do the audio version and it's just well, that's going to be pretty boring. It's going to get pretty boring pretty quickly, and people are going to tune out. Think about being on a roller coaster that's just going straight like the little kiddie one. It's not fun, right? You need twists, turns, ups, downs, picking up the speed, slowing it down before you pick it back up again. That's the essence and the rhythm of storytelling as well. So your shot should be the same way. The sentences that you use, you can create contrast through pacing, right? Longer sentences followed by shorter, more staccato sentences if you're a music person, right? You can create it by tone. Okay, it's a little happier, but then it gets dark, right? You can create it by conflict. Yes, everything was going great and I made $1 million, but then I lost it all. Right? So now you start to think of like, okay, what are the extra pieces I can add on in filmmaking in terms of composition and your shots? This might be going from a wide shot to that close-up, now showing the detail of the tear welling up in the main character's face. We talked about that earlier. Just thinking about not only what else can you use, but why. Why that sentence to compare or contrast with or work with or complement the previous sentence. Then you start to think about, oh, well, what's a piece to the story that I can add that might be a little unique to me, to my style, to my tone, to my voice? So now you're really starting to flesh it out and build it. And it's not just the skeleton, but now we're starting to doll it up. It's not just the foundation or the framing of your house. Now you're starting to make creative choices about, well, I'm Spike Lee, so I want to do the dolly shot where the person is on a dolly. If you've ever seen, Denzel, he uses it in every movie where the person and the camera are moving at the same time. It kind of looks like they're floating. Or, a lot of directors, Quentin Tarantino has a certain visual style. You, in your story, should certainly have a voice, right? What's a Rain Bennett story? And how does it sound differently than a you story? If we were talking about the same thing, given the same amount of time and the same resources to create that story, it should still be different because the way I set up my camera, literally and figuratively, should be different than the way you set yours up. I like to go handheld. Maybe you like static. So we sit in that moment. So now you start to think of, again, what's the most essential pieces of content that have to be there? What are the other pieces that can complement it? What are the next pieces that can create contrast and juxtaposition so you push and pull with tension? Then what are the unique shots, sentences, angles that you can use that start to separate your style, your tone, your voice from someone else? And then finally, we go to the editing process, the end of every great story. Right now I look at it and I've built this thing. Let me look at the storyboard of the whole story, the framework of my whole LinkedIn post, email newsletter, TikTok video, and start to see how and where I can trim. What's a little excessive? What might be redundant? What's a little fat that I can cut off of that meat, right? That's what we want to get it down to. This is always the final step. But laying it out, and sometimes you can actually write it out, transcribe the story that you have so far. Look at the sentences. If you have 2 sentences in a short video or a post that are essentially saying the same thing, and it's not for reinforcement's sake, but in one way you're saying, hey, I want you to get out of your mind, get out of the voice in the back of your head. And then I say something else, and then I follow it with, if you stay there in your head, it's not going to help you move forward. Those are 2 sentences kind of saying the same thing. So then I want to look at it and say, well, which one's more effective? And I think the latter is. If you don't get out of your head, you're not going to see your way forward. Instead of, hey, I want you to get out of your head. That doesn't say as much. It's not as powerful. So now I start to understand how I can make it crisp, clear, and efficient, therefore make that story effective. If you aren't cutting out the fat, it's not going to do that. This method is so important because we always deal with this when we're telling our story. And you'll see people talk about how to have empathy and how to create emotion and how to use sensory details and this structure and that structure. But we don't talk enough about sequencing. And that's a hill that I will die on. And you can sequence a 90-minute film with a note card technique or a storyboard. And you absolutely can sequence a LinkedIn post, an email newsletter, a TikTok video. What's the order of things the pieces that I'm putting in this story? What's the most essential? What's complementing that? What's contrasting that? What's showing off my tone? And what's just excess fat that doesn't need to be there? Again, listen to the episode with me and Nick Sung. You can find that at the Storytelling Lab, rainbennett.com, or you can just Google the Storytelling Lab and Nick Sung. You will find it. Nick is on LinkedIn. He's been doing a lot of great work in the animation space since I last spoke to him. Check out that episode. Check out Project Snow White between Airbnb and Pixar. It's an excellent way to think about the user journey and use storytelling to visualize that journey. And the next time you sit down to craft your LinkedIn post or to craft your email newsletter or to create your TikTok video, think about this. Look at the skeleton. Look at the framework. Am I telling this in the most efficient and powerful way so that this story will be effective and communicate with my audience in a way that will inspire action? Ultimately, my friends, that is all it comes down to. Thank you for tuning in today. Stay tuned for episode 157 with Mackenzie Heflin. We're going to talk about all things story. Tell your stories, sequence them in the right way, and they will